My presentation will be in English.
E mi scuso anche perché sarà un...
And I apologize because I will be rather fast because I have so many things to say. So hopefully we will be able to discuss some of the points during the Q&A session.
Scusate, ricordo chi lo desidera.
Now, if you want, at the entrance there are headsets for simultaneous translation. If you need translation into Italian, you can grab the headsets.
First, I would like to thank you, the organizers, for this splendid opportunity, and thank all of you for your interest in this matter I would like to discuss with you. My title is Can Buddhist Thought Be Critical? Modernity and Shunyata, and I think that you will understand why I chose this subtitle. This is the orientation. The considerations I do here are part of a work in progress I started about the problem of modernity, and I'm sorry if my presentation is not complete in all of its aspects, but here you see the subjects discussed. My intent here is to reflect about the possibilities of taking inspiration from some Buddhist ideas in order to discuss the interdisciplinary question of modernity, especially from the perspective of social sciences, social theory, and philosophy. In order to clarify my general orientation on this matter, I do believe that Buddhist ideas have what is needed to inspire an approach to the long debated question of modernity, for example, and to do so from a critical perspective. What do I mean here with critical? I do not refer to the idea of critical Buddhism developed by Hakamaya and Matsumoto from Kanazawa University, who considered critical as synonymous of rational, following certain demonstrations, and opposed to rhetorical and topology, as with Giambattista Vico. Here I use another meaning of critical, well expressed by Hartmut Rosa in his essay on 2010. According to him, the word critical could be taken from a long tradition that comes from Marx and the Frankfurt School, that means to search for the ways of living a good life. So today we do not live a good life. Rosa uses the word alienation to express this idea, which of course is different from the Buddhist dukkha, but probably more convergent than we think. In order to search for a good life or get rid of illusions, or at least the most dangerous illusions, we need to get a clearer vision parallel to the Buddhist drishti of the historical moment we live in. We need to approach the problem of modernity, its internal mechanisms and ways of operating. How can it be possible to get this clearer vision? Can Buddhism contribute to it, helping to make illusion collapse, or at least to reduce our tendency to cling to them as if they were true? Listening to the provoking speech by Jay Garfield in this conference last week, I was asking myself, are all illusions dangerous in the same way? Both emancipatory words and nationalistic ideologies. We may say, following a Buddhist approach, that they are both illusory. They are not ultimate. And yet, they are equally illusory perspective. Is there a possibility of living a life without illusions? And if not, as Professor Garfield seems to imply, then we should need to choose between illusions. Which is the less harmful, the one we cling less? The collapse of certain illusions implies that we realize that we are not living a good life, that we are alienated, and we are living an oppressive, uneasy life, although many hang on to the wishful thought that certain ideas, not objects, ideas, can make us permanently happy. This is, of course, a mistake. However, some illusions are particularly nasty, and among them I count essentialized identities, as from the conference by Professor Scherer last week. From a Buddhist point of view, we could probably say that these identities are, so to say, meat and drink to human attachment. And these identities are everywhere. A true fetishism comes out of these identities, and many times it is a kind of self-defense automatic mechanism. This fetishism, as any other fetishism, makes us strongly believe, even be sure, that these identities are real, and that we do not stop at nothing when it comes to such identities. We defend them. So much so that they have become a tremendous problem nowadays. The problem is connected with a more and more intense use of such identities in political, social, cultural, and even religious contexts. These identities are unfortunately very common intellectual tools used by nationalists as well as by homophobic, chauvinist, ethnocentric, culturalist thinkers and ideologues all over the world. They are global phenomena, present almost everywhere, and Buddhist institutions here and there, unfortunately, are not entirely immune to it. They turn out to be ideologies used as tools for war and dominations, discrimination and enslavement. These phenomena, which increase both our and our neighbors' suffering, need to be addressed somehow. And I'm going to start with this long citation by the lecture of Philosophy of History by Hegel that shows how acute the problem is. Hegel's is a classically Eurocentric approach. Eurocentrism is just one type of ethnocentrism, which is not merely a problem of the European history. It is a widely spread approach also in other countries, for example, China. However, Eurocentrism is particularly important for our discourse simply because the disciplines we use in order to study the world, reality, etc., are still profoundly indebted to it. So it's a kind of perspective we have. As you can see in this passage, there are some important parameters to be considered. For example, there's a strong stress on, a big stress on the dualistic differences between countries and people. And these differences are in nature, not in degree or in historical conditions. And of course, naturalized identities, differences, imply a transcendentalization, an absolutization of these traits. Hegel seems to display his haughty ignorance of the specific causes of this European victory over the pre-Columbian civilizations, clearly mistaking a historical series of events for an essence, an unchangeable trait. Here we have another citation by Gurminder Bhamra, a sociologist, because in sociology too, things have not been decisively better, even after more than 1 century later. Bhamra is trying to destroy these ethnocentric ideas, of course. According to her, the case of Marx and Weber are telling in this respect. In Weber, the model of study still remains European modernity. And in Marx, although from a critical position, the logic of capitalism is still molded upon European experience. Hence, the tendency to distinguish between center, which is important, fundamental, and margins, which are not important, accidental, and derivative. So, from these considerations, we should start making some premises. Theory is never innocent. It's never just theory. It's never immediate, just to use Professor Garfield's words. But here, more than epistemology, I would underline the political dimension of this issue, which is the practical dimension of this issue as well. Theory has a representational power and becomes easily ideological. A theory of modernity has often been a display of epistemic power by colonial or neo-colonial countries or by national states. Theories like this engender epistemic violence, as Gayatri Spivak says, or epistemic injustice, as Miranda Fricker told us. The violence or injustice are not performed only in one single culture or civilization. So the West is bad and the East is good. It's not like this. They are part of a general way of exerting power in representation, and hence they refer to metaphysical, psychological, epistemological dimensions. So we really need a more just theory. But how can we start thinking so? We may start rethinking our categories, probably, our visions through which we reconstruct our history, analyze the present, and look at the future. Of course, our efforts will be limited and our results partial at best. Every vision has its blind spot, every truth is a kind of illusion. But we need to do this anyway, because illusions are not all the same. There are different types of illusions, as well as different types of limits. A more just theory would be illusory and certainly will not save us, but maybe a change to our look at the world. And this may help us to be more careful and vigilant to what happens beyond our small courtyard and also within our courtyard, which makes it probably less dangerous than an ideological truth discourse based on essentialized identities. So, requirements. A theory of modernity should be non-essentialist, providing heuristic provisional value. Should be non-realistic, so nominalism of categories, realism versus nominalism idea, is needed to avoid the dangerous idea that certain historical phenomena are immediate, self-evident, just as we perceive them. Complex. It should be complex because with this term I refer to the requirement of being able to reflect interdependence among historical and social phenomena. And I may cite the example of the connected history by Sanjay Subramaniam, or the connected sociology of Gurminder Bambra. We saw a citation of her before. Hence, such a theory of modernity should stress, and I stress the conditional, should avoid dualism, past, present, civilized, uncivilized, advanced, non-advanced, ranks between different countries or different civilizations, rediscuss the priorities between center and margin, rediscuss the use of historical identities which are imagined, invented, ideologized, according to the idea by Johann Herders of cultural spheres that we must do war outside and homologation inside. So we need to reconstruct the past, acknowledging that that an epistemic historical process occurred to overcome the universalist reconstructions, because there is no peace without justice, even epistemic justice. So here you find some images of power. You see two very different representations of power, two types of illusions, if you like, but one is critical and ironic, this one here, you see, and the other one here makes the power relationship almost invisible and naturalized. You see the, I'm sorry, this one. Okay. This one here, you see the black person here. So, how is Buddhism involved in this project? Actually, in two ways. As an object of inquiry and criticism, for example, we can ask, how is it possible that some Buddhist-oriented thinkers, and here I'm talking more about thinkers and philosophers than social movements or institutions, was it possible that some thinkers had relied on essentialist, realistic, dualistic premises and forged essentialized historical identities? Even if these thinkers are not representative of Buddhist institutions of ideals, they still represent an always possible outcome of a Buddhist thought, and therefore we should investigate just to realize how such a problem was possible. The other thing is that Buddhism can also be involved in developing an idea of history far from the universal history, from Hegel to Francis Fukuyama, so to say, in favor of connected and complex representations. Here, of course, lays the problem of the scholar's vision and position and the ethics behind her and his work. Vision here is decisive. A correct vision can hit the target or miss it completely. Moreover, what is at stake here is not the content of vision per se, but how much that vision nurtures attachment, which, as Rupert Gething explains, just like a faint smell of dirt, clings to washed clothes and can persist even after a lot of spiritual practices. I foresee here at least three types of problems. The first is the complexity of the problem of modernity, which would need more or less an entire library to be fully addressed. Then we have the complexities of Buddhist ideas, and another library should be required. And the third, the ambiguities of certain Buddhist-inspired thinkers who have more or less already tried to deal with modernity. Now, let's move to the second part. So why do we have to cross critical thinking and Buddhism? I give you two reasons and one problem for this. The two reasons are two historical issues and examples of some problems Buddhism experienced in modern times. These famous publications by Brian Victoria, you see here, have denounced the full-fledged spiritual support of militaristic propaganda by many Japanese Buddhist monks during World War II. From this book, in that period, Buddhism emerges as a simple instrument in the hands of a ruthless political power, supporting the idea of a nationalist ideology that used identity as a tool for imperialist aggression and systematic oppression. This is an example of a connection between modern national states and Buddhism. Unfortunately, this was not an isolated case, and it's not confined to the sole experience of Japanese modern war period. This is the second example. The second reason. Of course, it is very different in space and time, and also in culture, and the Buddhist denomination implicated is different. It is, however, quite a macroscopic case, already cited many times during this conference. It's the case of Myanmar monk Ashin Wiratu, who actively and consciously preaches hate against Muslim minorities in his countries, inciting his fellow worshippers to act violently against them. Of course, this case, as well as the ones studied by Brian Victoria, they are not strictly philosophical, but however, are significant social phenomena that occur in modern world, and so they are examples of the connections, the possible connections between Buddhism and political and cultural identities. So we could ask, especially if we believed that Buddhism was supposed to be an inherently peaceful religion, and we acutely perceive the gap between our sometimes romanticized ideas and the cases in question, why is that? Is there any possibility to be sure to avoid such violent outcomes just by adhering to a certain system of ideas? Unfortunately, no. And why is that? Because every theory has the possibility to become the starting point of another illusion. So, do we have a vaccine that may be strong enough to repel the virus of hatred and attachment? A vaccine strengthens already existing antibodies. And so, is there something similar in Buddhism? Certainly, Buddhism has powerful antibodies against attachment and ideological illusions. For example, the doctrine of no self, of emptiness or dependent origination, etc. These are all powerful lymphocytes that protect us from illusion. Still, ideologies and attachments are like viruses. They always change strategy and can infiltrate very rapidly if these antibodies are not always vigilant and ready to intercept the specific spike protein of these viruses, their ways of operating and infect us. Now, sometimes during the modern era, some Buddhist-inspired thinkers have failed to recognize that ideology was the spike protein of attachment and got sick. Sometimes very sick, to the point of killing in the name of certain ideals. There is, however, a by far more subtle disease, but it's still quite a nasty one. Mistaking wellness and well-functioning for awakening. So if I feel comfortable with myself, I feel well after meditation, I keep anxiety at bay, and I'm efficient in my work without being overwhelmed by it, I feel satisfied. This commodified Buddhism, a commodified mindfulness, is certainly a kind of religion fit for late industrial capitalist system. It is a spiritual tool for those who, in order to avoid being too stressed by their own work, learn a spiritual technique to stay one step away from this work so that they can be in peace with themselves. Slavoj Žižek, for example, sarcastically calls it the Buddhist ethics and the spirit of global capitalism. Of course, this definition is after the famous Weber's work. As far it makes one perfectly fit in the system, perfectly functioning and avoiding the risk of burnout, it's all okay. It's the consumerist version of Buddhism that does not exert any critical pressure on the system. So, is it? Is Buddhist meditation a question of solving stress in a more or less demanding work and living environment? Although this is certainly a way of easing stress, it would also strengthen the system upon which illusions are built. The illusions of alienation and fetishism, for start, which are denounced by critical thought in history and by Buddha himself. Žižek interprets Buddhism as intrinsically problematic because of its teaching of no self, defined as a potential ally of authoritarian regimes. When the ego learns to flow with the events, whatever they are, it is part of the dance, as Žižek says, of the universe and becomes part of the reality. Hence, even if it does some bad actions, its ethical conscience, its critical content are silenced. If Buddhism preaches selflessness, the lack of egocentrism, but also the lack of doubts and second thoughts, as a slight detachment from the flow of events, this potentially condones every event the individual is required to perform out of a superior order or a duty or an unjust law. This risks to turn into an intolerable apology of the negative and the status quo, which always advantages the powerful and the wrongdoer. Here, the point is that our ego is not only the source of most of selfish acts, but also the source of ethical responsibility and cannot be simply overcome and exempted from being held accountable for what it does. But Zizek asks more precisely, can there be any ethics without a transcendental ego, or at least the self-illusion of a transcendental ego? Zizek, of course, is doing well his job of being Zizek, which is being provoking and generalizing. But the question of ethics of selflessness is a serious one, at least in the following formulation. Is the lack of selfishness an ethic good enough for our world in which powerful ideologies and consensus mechanisms change the problem of personal responsibility so as to include the responsibility of consciousness? In modern times, the individual is often only the final link of the chain of propaganda or information or capitalist consumerist system. This conditions the individual and is totally, as a part totally outside of his or her control. Is an individual complicit in her or his actions when obeying an unjust order without thinking about it? Would it be not that individual's responsibility includes that of exerting critical judgment about the historical, political, social, environmental situation he or she lives in? Just to prove that this is a real concern for Buddhists, as well as for any other people in the world, I will show you the case of Suzuki Daisetsu, who in some of his writings have fallen exactly in this trap. Suzuki, the great interpreter of Zen Buddhism in the West, has described Zen as the perfect spiritual training for warriors, because it teaches to become one with action, lifting the individual with all the indecisions that come from tethering and rationally pondering things. He ends actually with exalting the myth of a pure action, as you can see here. Here, Suzuki interprets Zen approach according to the needs of a practice free from the burden of conscience. The content in which these words were written and pronounced was the year 30 of the 20th century, a period in which Japan had already entered a terrible phase of militarism and aggressive military expansion. Such an insistence on the military advantages of Zen is certainly not a good sign of thinking critically and responsibly. These ideas are, we may say, pre-political, which Foucault may have integrated them inside the idea of biopolitics. We now turn to see which identity is questioned in Buddhism. In general, it may be possible, probably, to say that limiting Buddhist emptiness or Buddhist anatta, anatman, to the problem of individual identity is a very limited, although still possible, way of facing the problem. If we turn, for example, to Milinda Pagna, from which this passage is drawn, we see that the issue of personal identity is played as one aspect of a much bigger picture, that of the relationship between language, thought, visions, and reality on one hand, and the question of the interdependent character of such a reality on the other. You see here two passages of the text that indicates these 2 points. The problem is that our language and thought cling to identities that do not really exist, and we are blind to the unceasing flux of interconnections and causes and effects. Connected causality is therefore the key point, which means that all beings exist as causal connections or sets of interaction. Causal chains and causal continuity, however, do not exclude ethical connections. So Zizek is probably rightly worried when dealing with Suzuki's irrationalism, but in Buddhist texts, the thesis that morality derives from a transcendental self has been confuted, as well as the opposite thesis that there is no morality at all. The causal connections, which are myself, are a stable flux that continues to produce effects out of my actions. From such a perspective, Suzuki's position appears to be close to some sort of nihilistic vitalism. The problem is not limited to the sole individual identity, however. It is the problem of identity per se. Every identity, political, social identity included, are within the picture. And of course, the identity of theory itself is so. So here you find a passage taken from Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyama Kakarika that state that emptiness is not a view, but the letting go of all views, included emptiness itself. And any view, any drishti, in fact, is a potential source of attachment, no matter how good this view is. Our mind tends to formulate views, conceptual proliferations, constructions, and we tend to dangerously blur reality with these views, among which the very Buddha's teachings are included. So emptiness here does not affirm any ontological position, because this is intrinsically dangerous, but only an epistemological and ethical one. These quotations from Nagarjuna indicate that emptiness, as the absence of all views, helps to open to the complexity of reality, which is the dependent co-arising, pratitya samutpada. Only the absence of views allows the conditioned reality of effects and causes, agents and actions to emerge. And now we go to another section. Can there be, therefore, a Buddhist-inspired critical thinking concerning modernity? Let's go back to the beginning of my presentation. You see the same question I was asking before. I may say that Buddhism may have what it takes to inspire, at least theoretically, a theory of modernity with the required characteristics. For example, it considers theoretical affirmations and concepts as provisional names, not transcendental truths, whose value is heuristic and not essentialized. Then emptiness as dependent co-arising can help us to focus on historical phenomena with a different approach. It can help to reduce, for example, the use of methodological nationalism, quite spread in certain cultural contexts, as well as the universalistic ideologies of destiny. For example, Francis Fukuyama's idea of the end of history. At the same time, this approach could stimulate, not reduce, research whenever certain labels and denominations are criticized and the complexity of human condition in human science and social philosophy is underlined. So let's move to the scheme of modernity. Well, yes, I know this would be much better. That would be much better. If only the scheme were this one, of course. It is not to make any comparison, just to quickly raise the issue that the schemes are presented also in the Buddhist world too, and are surely much nicer than the following one here. This one I call the Mandala of Modernity. And it is a simplified scheme that may explain how modernity could be approached. And it is still a mess, I know. I'm sorry. It looks like a badly drawn mandala. And the general question could be something like this. How to deal with complexity? Do we have to simplify it? And to what extent? in order that our representations, even our graphic representations, be still saying something about the set of events they refer to. Here I have to make a disclaimer. Each of these areas are extremely complex groups of phenomena. Grouping these phenomena is accomplished for heuristic purposes only. For example, these purposes can be the fact that it's more orderly, or hopefully so, and more easily understandable and presentable during this presentation, for example. That at a certain point has to be stopped, or to your great relief. But they are approximations whose level is up to many factors. Moving to look closer to the different parts of the scheme, we find the idea of social acceleration by Hartmut Rosa. In many, many theories, both classic and contemporary, we find, for example, in Marx and in Hegel, when in Manifesto they say, all that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. Here, this refers, as in Hartmut Rosa's approach, to a series of processes that concern all aspects of society, culture, economy, such as work, gender, family, relations, etc. Everything accelerates. To this, another group of factors should be added, what I call the quasi-non-human world, which implies ecological, economic, technological, and scientific factors that influence our lives greatly. These factors are another set of factors that cause the social acceleration effects touching all aspects of our lives, from our work and social family relations, etc. These changes are so rapid and so radical that they are powerfully demanding an equally powerful social and cultural answer. These different types of answers are the representational answers that can take the shape of ideologies, and at the same time, these answers urge us to search for identities, aspiration to freedom. These identities should be considered in a very wide sense, including social, religious, epochal, individual, gender, cultural, even food identities. We Italians are very proud of our food identity, but actually it generally has been constructed just more or less 50 years ago. So all these phenomena and factors, which include human and quasi-non-human worlds, and which include accelerated changes, the social effects, and the representational answers to these changes, could be grouped within a macro phenomenon called modernity. That stands, therefore, for an extremely vast number of phenomena for which we do not have a single, simple approach. This concept, however, generic, could have a kind of heuristic value as long as it is considered as a tool for building general integrated theories and ideas, useful for a better understanding of the present world. However, macro concepts contain many potential pitfalls. They easily turn into various types of essences or identities that can be easily essentialized. In order to avoid such a pitfall, modernity, therefore, should not be considered as if it were just one single substantial identity or entity endowed with specific characteristics. We could say that modernity is a series of processes that catalyze and essentialize identities. But these processes are very different from one another. These identities too can be very different in strength, embeddedness, essentialization. There can be relatively fluid identities together with fixed and stiff ones. So a general trend is, however, that modern processes generally encourage the essentialization of such identities. Many examples could be brought. I just give one of them. Professor Scherer last week recalled the fact that Michel Foucault explained that the invention of homosexual as an essentialized identity occurred in the second half of 19th century. It's not just a chance. I tried to implement some basic Buddhist ideas in this scheme. In historical and sociological terms, emptiness can be translated in three ways: as a methodological epistemological caution towards categories, used only for heuristic value, which must be considered from a nominalist standpoint, as a deontological stimulus to promote an analysis mindful of interdependence and complexity of historical cultural data. This can be defined as the level of specific groups of factors, or these factors you say quasi-non-human factors or social accelerations, etc. Each factor is a composite set of phenomena. It's not just one thing. They are just composite, and they can be decomposed as much as we like. And this is also another point. Another important question is, could be the centrality of alienation in this scheme, which may function as the basic mechanism to contextualize many of the dynamics that occur in modernity, ideology included. And it is very close somehow to the Buddhist idea of dukkha, like a sensor that alerts us that things are not exactly as we think they are. So I am trying to avoid any definition of modernity in terms of an essence or a substance of sort. Modernity here can only be a word that points to many historical factors. And by the way, each factor can be seen in turn as a set of another more specific factors. For example, industrialization here. Industrialization is an important factor in establishment and the development of modernity, but it can be seen also as a kind of result of many different and casual factors. Completely casual factors, as with Kenneth Pomerantz' model of the so-called Great Divergence. This book by Kenneth Pomerantz reconstructs the genesis of the industrialization, avoiding the purely European standpoint, and which isolates Europe from the rest of the world, and then, because of this, needs to create a variegated series of cultural mythologies in order to explain it. Here, industrial revolution is a global, from the beginning, a global phenomenon. And in order to understand it, we need to resort to, for example, triangular or better, quadrangular commerce routes. In addition, industrialization can be reconstructed from a series of multiple causal factors that have played a fundamental role in the development of modern economies. This approach implies, for example, that European countries were not as strong as the Asian countries until 1750. Starting from 1750 on, European countries, not really. Great Britain, not really. Certain parts of Great Britain, okay? Only certain parts of Great Britain started to have a small, little, but decisive advantage compared to certain other parts of China, for example. This is just to say that we do not have a modernization. We do not have even any industrialization. We do not have even Europe here. We have just very, very small, very analyzable small parts. You see, something very similar to what Buddhism thinks about identity. Okay, so finally, I don't know how much time do I have? Okay. In this final part, I'm going very rapidly through certain examples, most taken from Kyoto School, that shows certain problems in the relationship between Buddhism and modernity. I would like to have a rapid look to the way in which the Kyoto School approached modernity, because this can give us some important hints about the problem of modernity and the way Buddhism can approach it. Here I'm trying to summarize very different and complex series of issues. And so inevitably my approach would seem a bit inaccurate and generic. Here you see a list of important Kyoto School thinkers. There is one trait that probably could be common to at least some of these authors in dealing with modernity, especially before Second World War. So they are not all the same, beware, they are not all the same, but a certain orientation is there. In a nutshell, this common trait seems to point to a heavy emphasis on the problem of individual interiority and subject that derives from their post-idealistic and phenomenological influences. They often saw in the problem of the subject, the individual, the main issue of our time, of modernity. And when trying to solve many questions in political philosophy or in the philosophy of history, especially before 1945, they relied on a strongly interiorized approach, which has encountered many problems dealing with most of the history of historical world. So it could be affirmed that their path to deal with modernity is strongly dependent on their need to overcome the subject, to the point that this has caused, at least until World War II, I mean here subject, not identity in general, but the subjective identity. This is the difference I would like to point at. It's not valid for all of them, but for some people, absolutely. This caused a kind of distorted perception of modernity. Subjectivity and individualism often have been identified with modernity and juxtaposed to the nationalist motifs, so the imperial family, the alleged traditional Japanese ethos, and Buddhism too, considered as traditional. And here, juxtaposing the tradition of Japanese tradition on one hand and modernity on the other, they forgot that many of these traditions, these Japanese traditions, were just invented during modern times. Okay. Nishitani Keiji here, for example, a leading figure of the Kyoto School philosophy, has exemplified some modern ethics of no-self, theorizing self-annihilation of self-sacrifice for the sake of the state and community. And he was saying this during the aggressive militaristic phase of Japanese history. Let us analyze some of these passages. Here there are many things to be highlighted actually, but here you see the centrality of the state versus the individual as a typical modern political and ethical structure. He clearly affirms that the state must have deeper and deeper contacts with the individuals in order to work well. Hence, he realizes the importance of mobilization and involvement of the individuals within the national state. But he does not recognize the modernity of this trait. He also realizes the cancellation of social and political space that disappears within one single collective man, so that the collectivity acts as if it were a single individual. He points to a kind of ethicization of this model, but Hannah Arendt has warned us that something similar was the fundamental structure of totalitarianism. Annihilation or self-sacrifice is required to single individuals who must disappear so that the ethical state can appear. It is therefore highly problematic that Nishitani could see such a modern political relationship only from the perspective of a naive moralism of self-sacrifice, in which the main factor is still the individual. This makes his position, at least in this period, blind to state centralism and nationalism, on the basis of the belief that this self-sacrifice by the individuals may moralize the national state. At best, this is idealistic, at worst, cynical. Certainly, the scale involved in such a process has nothing to do with individual ethics anymore. Okay. Here we find a different passage from Nishitani. It's a nihilism, taken from Nihilism, a work that he wrote, he published in 1967. Here, political questions are not discussed anymore. He is writing these pages after the religious existential turn that taken by the Kyoto School after Second World War. The main question is the problem of nihilism, which Nishitani interprets quite originally as the problem of the self in itself. It results that nihilism is not simply the loss of moral and religious values in general, or the lack of reasons and aims, as in Nietzsche, for example, but is to be enacted as the full awareness of the end of values and the sense of myself, in all of its practical, bodily, and existential meanings. It is a clearly Buddhist-oriented approach, and a very original one at that. Nihilism involves primarily our own self in an existential and practical perspective. It means that the very self has become a big question mark to itself, something close to the Zen state of great death, for example. And here the practice of emptying the mind goes up to a metaphysical insight into reality as such, as James Heisig says. However, there is a problem here, and here I'm going to conclude. This approach seems to continue the fundamental perspective that links all the problems to the self in the individual, whereas the individual is still the key to the solution of all these problems, or at least the only way of facing them. Certainly, a deep personal involvement in the problems is admirable and essential. Okay, this is not in question. But it's not the end of the story. Certain questions cannot simply be solved on the individual scale. Even if the individual consciousness remains fundamental as a way of conscious resistance and as a way of critical stand. The individual is required to have enough consciousness, ethical, social, historical, cultural, ecological, just to avoid that through her or his unclear vision, things get worse. Individual practice is decisive at the micro level for one to be more awake, aware of the many problems of the world. But it can only indirectly solve the problems at the macro level. Finally, I present you this beautiful image to express the idea of interconnection. Can it be a kind of inspiration from a different approach to history and integrate critical questions within its ethics and everyday practices? This is actually a big question for a thought inspired by Buddhism, although I think not an impossible one, as I have tried to explain. I thank you for your attention.